Welcome to Incorporate, the podcast for business owners presented by the UB Center for Entrepreneurial Leadership, where we dive into real stories, strategies, and struggles behind small business success. I'm your host, Susan Steffan, the Executive Director of the Center for Entrepreneurial Leadership, better known as CEL. Today, we're talking about a topic that's critical, but maybe sometimes overlooked, succession planning. With me for all our podcasts is our producer, Jordan Lema, founder of Lema Studios, where we are recording this podcast today. And joining with me today are two incredible guests who've lived this very experience. Kathleen Chiavetta, a third-generation family member in a legacy business, and Shawn Buffum, a non-family CEO who stepped in to lead a family business through succession. Thank you both for being here. And we're going to start with, if you could, just give me a quick snapshot of your business. What does it do and what is your role in the business? Kathleen, you want to start?
Sure. So my family's business is Chiavetta's Catering and Chicken Barbecue. We are a multi-generation family business, well known for chicken barbecue in the Western New York area. If you drive by a parking lot and there's barbecue smoke coming from it, it's probably us.
I would say Buffalo's best chicken sauce.
I would say that too,
so.
Jordan.
Okay.
Yes, thank you for that plug.
Yeah, because it's also, I mean, you could correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's like a healthier sauce.
It is.
Yeah, like
because
it's not like butter,
it's vinegar
not
based.
that stuff.
Yeah, right. It's not the tomato
are there
based.
even calories in it?
That's exactly. There's not many calories, and there's like maybe one carb.
All right.
Yeah, it's very diet friendly. Get it on your local store shelves today.
But it's also, I mean, it's an icon in Buffalo. It's
Yes.
something that everyone recognizes. And I learned about Chiavetta's chicken when I was like maybe 7 or 8 years old at a tailgate with my dad. And in addition to the Chiavettas, Dick Johnson, the person who was the cook, also poured beer on there. And as a child, I was a little concerned about the beer, but it was delicious. And I've been hooked on Chiavettas ever since.
Fun fact, if I can give a plug, because you brought up beer, we have a co-branded partnership with Resurgence about to come out
Very
this
cool.
summer for a beer can chicken.
All right.
Oh, very
Excellent.
neat.
Yeah,
Very
details to follow.
Wonderful.
All right. Shawn, tell us about you.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Susan. Shawn Buffum, CEO of Orville's Home Appliances, and my role in the company is running the operation day to day. And my involvement in the succession planning was I was actually brought into the company as its succession plan for the leadership. So the former CEO of the company, who was a non-family member, had been there for about 30 years and was seeking an individual who could come in and take the family business into future decades with the same type of leadership style that they've enjoyed for the growth that they've had over the past almost 60 years in Western New York.
Right. And Orville's, like Chiavetta, is a very iconic brand. But a lot of people probably don't know how broad your product line is, right? Especially we were just talking before the podcast started about some of the higher end stuff that Orville's carries now.
Agreed. So we started out as a single store in Buffalo, family owned, first generation, 1965, and then expanded throughout Western New York. We have 4 showrooms in Buffalo, and then we opened 4 additional showrooms in Rochester, and then have a 9th location, which is our regional distribution center and warehouse. And, you know, as far as product offering, it's everything from replacement when something breaks. We were discussing earlier how appliances really don't last as long as they used to. That is just a matter of fact with a lot of things these days. And then all the way up to very high-end built-in appliances for someone who is remodeling or sort of building their dream kitchen, which during COVID, that became very popular, both in utilization. People just wanted to create a more comfortable space at home. And what we see a lot today is similar. People want to create a space where they can entertain, and we carry a wide breadth of appliances that you can choose from.
Oh, yeah, that's amazing. And you mentioned, Shawn, that you were brought in as part of the succession plan. So tell us a little bit about how that worked, not being a part of the family, but taking over a family business, essentially.
Yeah, so it was an interesting connection. I'll credit the connection to golf. I like to golf, and Orville's was actually a customer of mine in a media company that I worked for. So through that relationship and through golf, I built a relationship with the leadership team and with the family. And they had mentioned that they were trying to find another non-family member that could come in and run the company for them going into the future. And I was hesitant at first because it wasn't an industry I was familiar with. And once I understood the business a little bit better and understood the family members, built a relationship with them, it's an incredible story that they have. It's really a legacy in Western New York. The way that they're customer focused and the culture of the company really attracted me. So coming into the organization, I worked closely with the now third generation family member, and that was really how I got involved in CEL, and then eventually doing the succession plan through CEL with the backdrop and help from my mentors and reactors.
Interesting. And Kathleen, a little bit differently because you've got the name, right? The Chiavetta name, the third generation, correct? So what does that feel like? And what is the weight of that legacy on your shoulders?
Oh, yeah. It's, with great power comes great responsibility. And that's really how I sum it up. I get really passionate when I talk about this. It's such a privilege, truly, and actually it feels a little awkward to talk about it sometimes when you bear the name, of one of those Buffalo brands and of a 3-generation legacy. We are so fortunate to be so beloved in Western New York. And so I really do consider what I get to get up and do every day a privilege. However, the other side of that is the huge responsibility. We were talking a little bit before we started on how difficult it is to sustain family businesses when you go from generation to generation. It's a huge responsibility to keep the standards, that gold standard that everyone is used to for chicken barbecue in Western New York. Business gets more expensive. We talked a lot about institutional knowledge, right? People who've been with you for a long time might not necessarily stay forever. And then just the change that comes when you have a change in leadership, like you do in any organization, trying to be consistent and keep the business and the name and the legacy strong. It's very rewarding. It's also a lot of hard work.
So, Kathleen, we were talking a little bit, the weight of a family business and the responsibility, but also the fact that, when I have a bad day at work, I don't go home to the problem, right? So how do you deal with the fact that the family, your business and your family are forever intertwined and you really can't separate them? How do you not let that affect, Christmas and Thanksgiving and everything else?
I don't know. Can someone tell me? No. So this is a learned skill. Really. And some of it starts with boundaries. My middle daughter got really good at a very young age at saying, "Oh, are we talking business at the Easter dinner table? No, I don't think so." And the little reminders from an 11-year-old actually really helped me look at that. Oh, you know what? We should have some rules and we should have some boundaries. And so when we're together as a family, we really try not to talk about business. I think that's been really helpful. And another thing that, frankly, has been another learned skill for us is honest and open communication. Having those conversations like, look, what we're talking about is uncomfortable and awkward right now. Our goal is to remain friends, family at the end of this conversation. So let's just start with that, with the end in mind. And I think you have to really work hard to build a lot of trust and foundational relationships. If your personal relationships, your family relationships outside of work are not good, they're not usually going to be good when you're in work. The relationships really need to be healthy, and you need to do a lot of things like that communication, spending time together to build the trust. And that can really take time. The benefit of that is when you've done that work and you've built that trust, those relationships can be really powerful because you do have that safety net of trust with a family member that you might not have with a colleague that you've spent a few years working with. At the end of the day, you have a strong personal relationship, and that's going to be the safety net for anything challenging that you have to talk about at work. But it took a lot of time to develop that.
Yeah. And how is that different, Shawn, for you when you're, I'm sure not everybody in the family, wasn't as smooth as what it might be, right, with somebody from not the family coming in. How did you navigate those waters?
So it's interesting, though, what Kathleen is describing for her own family dynamic, it's very similar being a non-family member involved in a family business. So a lot of the same dynamics, especially amongst the generations. So our current majority owner is the second generation of the family. And, I think he was always living in the shadow of his father who had started the business. And for the third generation, it's still trying to maintain that legacy and all the things that the company was built on. But they also understand that because of the growth and the size of the business, you need to find the best people possible to run the company. And that doesn't always mean that it's a family member. And that's just a very, I think, interesting way and very intelligent way of analyzing your business and saying, even though this person isn't a blood family member, if they're the best person possible to handle all these different aspects of the company, we should bring them in. And they've done that repeatedly. So the management team is exclusively non-family. However, the ownership and what they want as a long-term legacy of the family business is for it to stay in the family, stay in Western New York, stay locally owned. So that's that, the weight that you talk about, Kathleen, feeling that responsibility. I feel that. I feel that as much as they do as family members. And the dynamic is very good. Because of their willingness to have open communication, we're very honest with each other. There really is no pulling of punches, just like we would be honest as family members. It's the trust, right? I am a non-family member, right? I'm not coming into this having grown up with all these individuals, but in a lot of ways that makes it easier for me to be honest and not have to worry so much about some past, relationship or past conversation where that may have been a touchy subject. Succession planning in this case was sort of the elephant in the room. Everybody knew that they needed to talk about it. Everybody knew that the next generation, we have to have a plan for that. But there really wasn't anyone who was pushing that agenda forward. I was the catalyst for that. And that in a very positive way. Everybody was very open to it. It was just finally sitting down at the table, literally at the dining room table at the owner's house and having those conversations.
And so that sounds like it was very intentional, right? To start focusing on succession planning, and you as a big piece of that.
Absolutely. So when I went through CEL, you create a clinic objective. And at first, when I met with the family, I said, perhaps the best approach here is to have objectives that are based on the organization and some things that we could change within the organization from a operational perspective. And uniformly, they were like, no, we know we need to do this. We know it might be uncomfortable, but that has to be your objective. Your objective is figuring out how to move this company in our single points of failure that we have in place, the management team, different roles in the company. We need to start planning for the next generation in the future. And that's what you're going to focus on.
Now, you're both third-generation businesses, which statistically, that's a trouble zone. How are you navigating that? And are you taking classes and programs especially to learn to avoid the pitfalls of the third generation? Or what would you say to someone who's in a third-generation business about what's the best way to succeed here?
I think you are giving us the opportunity to make a great plug for CEL because all joking aside, I think there is a lot of power in knowing that I don't want to say the odds are against you because that makes it kind of sound impossible, but in knowing that older family businesses have high rates of failure and then making sure you are educating yourself. And for me, and I think it's probably at least a little true for you, coming to CEL was the best thing I could have done because it has connected me with every resource I could possibly need. It has surrounded me with businesses who can share experience. It has surrounded me with family businesses who are older than mine or larger than mine. And there are so many valuable lessons I have learned from each and every one of them. So I think it's knowing what you're up against and making sure that you are planning and tapped into the most powerful resources you can be. And for me, that's right here.
And I would agree with what Kathleen said about CEL and that network. And I would add to it that in our industry, we are part of a group. So we have like-sized independent appliance dealers across the country that we can network with. And in many cases, they're multi-generational as well. and we lean on each other for support, much like we do locally with the CEL network. But to Kathleen's point, it's absolutely about educating, getting advice from other family businesses. You start to see some of the pitfalls of where some of the challenges are and why they might fail. I think in a lot of cases, it's a lack of understanding of the operation, lack of understanding of competition and economic factors that are happening around you, and then having a willingness to change. You have to be willing to be self-aware of what your strengths are and your weaknesses. And like I said, in our case, it's the family recognizing that we need outside help. And even once I took over the role of CEO, I recognized we had a void in our management team. We found that resource. We went out, recruited that person, and brought them in because that helped complete what we needed from a leadership perspective. So it's you can't have too much non-awareness and willingness to ask for help when you need it. I think that's huge.
I think that's so well said, Shawn. And there's so much value in that outside perspective, because when you've been in something your whole life, it can be really hard to be objective about it. When you're in a family business, a thing I learned very early in my time in CEL from someone many people might remember, Bob Pirelli, there's no difference between your family system, your family dynamics, and your work system and your work dynamics. We can talk all day long about wanting to leave our family baggage at home. We're people at the end of the day, and it kind of creeps in. So family issues, and let's be honest, all families have issues, even if you all love each other and get along really well. It's hard to not bring those into the workplace and have that be your dynamic. And having that outside fresh perspective is so critical. The family has to be open to it, right? The people in the business have to be open to that perspective. But it's really important because, it's so cliche to say it, but we all know that saying, the most dangerous phrase in business is because this is how we've always done it. And it doesn't have to be a family business. It can be any business that's starting to experience longevity. You get kind of mired in the ways you've always done things. And I think something you touched on, Shawn, is a real pain point for a lot of business is what I call failure to professionalize, failure to operationalize, right? We kind of have done things this way all along, and it's worked really well for us, but you're not necessarily keeping up with competition. You're not necessarily keeping up with changing trends because it feels comfortable and it's worked until it doesn't.
A lot of family businesses are older, especially a third generation. I mean, Chiavetta's has gone 70 years.
Yeah, we were 70 last year.
So to think, this is how we've always done it. 70 years is a lot of change. It's a lot of world to change. And I can see it being a combo of fresh ideas from the new generations coming in, but also resistance from the older generations, but I can't imagine navigating that with a father or a grandfather or any of that.
And so that's the challenge for people in my position and for Shawn's position, because the business is 70 years old for a reason. There are a lot of things that have gone right and have been done right to get a business to the third generation. So for leaders in our position, it's about finding that balance. You want to preserve what works, right? What's tried and true? What's your core identity? You want to preserve those things. And in fact, I think in most cases, you need to preserve those things. And then figuring out what does need to change. What are the things? Where do we need to be innovative and agile and adaptive without losing what got us to this place?
And I think something that helped, like in our business, COVID happened, right? So the in-person experience, whether it was shopping or dining, that was changing during that time, and it forced innovation. And so in our business, the big change was that we really didn't have a great online experience. You could get this wonderful in-store experience at a showroom and you could see the product and you could buy it. But if you're at home and you wanted to do that, how do we make that transactional? How do we make it frictionless so it's a good experience? What we found is we need to make a huge investment in that. That's the future. That's really where more of our shoppers are coming from, and we're seeing that today. So now that innovation has led to a focus and resources to making that the best experience possible. I'm sure in your business, Kathleen, it's similar. You have to be willing to innovate while preserving what makes your brand unique. And that can be tricky, but that's the legacy that we're both, I think, trying to preserve in what we do for the future.
COVID was a huge catalyst for us as well. And I think it was for many businesses. Our business actually did very well during COVID. Some of us were fortunate that, that was a very challenging time for a lot of businesses because we were ready to innovate and to be adaptive, but it also exposed where we needed to change and evolve. I refer to COVID as the change we needed. It was kind of the crisis we needed because it highlighted also things that we had taken for granted for a really long time. That wasn't the case anymore. I think it actually really helped us become more dynamic by nature.
I want to talk for a minute about resources for, let's say there's a business owner listening to this podcast who thinks, oh, I really haven't done anything about succession planning, haven't really thought about it. Who are the advisors, the external advisors that help with that, the planners, the accountants? How do you navigate who you need to have on your team to build that succession plan?
For us, the resources were having an outside person who can lead the discussions. Through CEL, connected with my mentor who was instrumental in just navigating those conversations between the family and the management team. In addition to that, things like estate planning, estate attorneys, CPAs. We did reach out to some additional consultants to consider what would happen if we became an ESOP. What if we were an employee-owned company? All of those things started with a basic question. And the basic question was, what does success look like? What happens when this company becomes a transaction, which nobody wants to see that happen, but it's going to happen at some point. At some point, there's going to be a need to have the business moving in some direction. So what does that look like? How does that preserve family interests and ownership, but also take care of employees and take care of the brand? And is it a merger? Is it an acquisition? Is it growth? What is it? So you start sort of with that thought in mind. And it was interesting. There was a comment that was made by our current second generation owner that when we sat down literally at the dining room table to start these discussions, he said, I feel like we're planning my funeral. And it was difficult, but it was difficult for him to pivot from thinking that way to, no, you're taking this legacy and creating what success will look like for your children and your grandchildren, all the generations and all the families that you've supported for all these years. So once we pivoted around that corner, it was a totally different conversation. Then there was enthusiasm and excitement about what will this be going forward, not a negative that you're sunsetting something that you've built. It's not about that. It's about carrying that forward. And what that exposes in those conversations are things that they've never thought of before. So for us, it was single points of failure. We had way too many of them. Well, that's the person who was always done it for us. What if they're not there anymore? Right. What if this new thing is, a requirement for the operation? Who's going to step in and do that? So that became a real focus, building out that next team and identifying the deficiencies so we could plan for it.
Yeah, you said a couple of things that are so important. I think we refer to that as building our bench. In our organization, we also had a lot of single points of failure. And I think that's something, again, that maybe isn't unique to family businesses, but older, closely held businesses, there's a lot of institutional knowledge that's up here, up in your head, and you have to get it down on paper. Let's say there have to be processes. We don't allow anybody in our organization to be the only person who knows how to do a thing. There always has to be sort of that next, I call it the designated survivor. There always has to be the next person in line who knows how to do a thing. And something, Shawn, that you and I have talked about is that ability for that leader, and in our case, it's the second generation for both of us, to start to step back. And that can be a really hard thing. Many people, whether they're in a family business or not, their identity is very tied to their career. I think it's a little different and a little more unique in a family business because not only is your identity so tied with this thing you've built, your name is. And it is not an easy thing for many people to think about. You talked about sunsetting, right? To think about stepping back. I give a lot of credit to the family at Orville's for knowing they need a plan. Our situation was much different, and I'm not saying better or worse, just different. We're a much smaller business than Orville's. Things for us happened so much more gradually. There was never a clear, we've had a lot of dining room discussions around this. But never to sit down and say, okay, what's our succession plan? And I certainly don't think we're unique in that. When there isn't a set retirement date, there isn't a set date for somebody else to necessarily step into the role. And I have a lot of grace and compassion and sympathy for people in that situation because it's really hard to do. I always tell this story that my dad has kind of stepped back in waves. First, he sort of gave up his office because we needed more office space. And then he would start telling people he was semi-retired. And then there was one day I heard him retelling a conversation he had with somebody else. And he said, oh, it's okay, I'm retired now. And I was like, wait, what'd you just say? So I'm going to write down the date that you just went from semi-retired to retired. It can happen really gradually, and I don't think that's uncommon.
Wow.
I always hear people talk about when they're going to retire, and they say, well, within the next 2 years. And all that means, I think, is not next year. There's not really a plan, just not in the next year.
It's sometime.
Yeah.
But so one of the cornerstone philosophies of CEL is that business owners, despite the fact that their businesses are different, have so much in common. So it's very cool to see your two businesses, which are so different. I mean, chicken barbecue and sauce and appliances have so much overlap. And that's just the power of the CEL program.
Right. It's really interesting, though, to hear the dynamics. And we talk about the communication and the succession planning in specific to these family businesses, but it's any business. If you have no equity in a business and you're the CEO, what happens if you're not there? Where is your bench strength? A lot of people in business like to think they're the only one who can do things. It's part of their identity, but that's really a problem. And I think businesses, whatever business is listening, needs to think about their bench strength. For every key position, who can do that position if that person is no longer willing, capable, or physically able to do that? Who are your next in line for everything? So I think succession planning we can think about as being a lot broader of a topic even than just whose name is going to be on the CEO slot. Oh,
and especially in a family business, I think there's a distinction that some people fail to make. There's a difference between ownership succession and leadership succession. And those are sometimes the same thing and sometimes they're not. For us, those are happening on two different tracks and two different timelines, and that can make things kind of tricky. And back to the point you made earlier, that's why it's really important to have advisors, whether it's legal, accounting, financial, estate planning, or it's family businesses who have gone through it and can share their experience with you.
And Susan, that's an important distinction. So when we met to discuss the plan, it became bifurcated into there needs to be an equity succession plan, which had different resources that it was going to need to make that happen. And then the operational transition plan. Those were, in some cases, there is overlap, but they're really two separate conversations. And I also think something you mentioned earlier, Kathleen, it's not just about the people, but it's the standards of performance. So all of those things that end up being that person knows how to do it and they've always done it, then document it. You have to document it and then be prepared that when that person's not there, who will do it going forward and what needs to be changed. So that's just part of that process that exposes some of those areas of the business that you probably haven't thought about before, but you have to be very intentional and make plans to do that.
Yeah. What type of process would you advise for somebody who's thinking, I'm behind on this whole topic, whether they're a family business or not? How do you even start? Like, what's an easy first step?
I mean, for us, it was really just having the conversation and finally being very honest with everyone that was a stakeholder in the process to say we have to, in earnest, really sit down and do this. And it started out very slow and everybody has to have patience, but you definitely have to be intentional about setting some type of timeline when this is going to happen. And luckily, everybody that was involved at Orville's was very open to that. And CEL was a huge backstop for us, right? Anytime we'd run into a little bit of friction or we'd start to pause in the process, it was easy to say, well, we have this whole group of experts behind us that are all saying the same thing. And that makes it a little easier, I think, specifically with family members where maybe there isn't the same opinion, but then you say, well, these third-party experts are all agreeing this is the best approach. Well, okay, how do you argue against that? But I think the absolute most important first step is just agreeing that this is something that needs to be done, putting some type of deadline on it, and then starting that process with the very first question, which is, what does success look like?
That's exactly what I was going to say. You made that point earlier, and I think it's really important. What do you want? And I think a lot of smaller family businesses would say, and I know because I've talked to them, what they want is for the next generation to be the generation that takes over, right? To be family owned and operated, family led. And sometimes that works. In our case, that is working, and that's very fortunate. And sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes there aren't family members that are next in line. Sometimes there are. And this, I think, is the most challenging thing of all, or can be. Sometimes there are family members coming up through the ranks, but they're not the right fit. And it has to be right on both sides, right? The generation coming up has to be capable of, and family owned and led can look different. It doesn't have to look the same business to business. There can be different supports and different structures, but the person has to be capable. And a piece of advice I give to people who are in my position, the generation coming up, you have to want it, and you have to want it for the right reasons. I think when I was younger, I thought a lot about the legacy and the name and the benefits and the privilege. And I thought I understood the responsibility and the work, and I did not. There are many reasons family members are in businesses. One, it's the job they've always had, and they don't really know what else they do or where they go. It's, the easy job, the easy money. And some of it, sometimes you see obligation, people who feel like, oh, this is what mom and dad are expecting of me, and I really don't want to let them down. It's a long career and a long, hard road if you don't want to be there. You have to be passionate about it. And then again, on the flip side, if you're the generation starting to let go, you're not letting go, if you don't have the confidence in that person you're bringing up. And so it's really important for whoever the successor is, whether it's family or non-family, to spend the time learning the business so that they understand the commitment they're making, and you have the time to see that they're capable of doing what needs to be done.
Agreed. And I would just add that the word you used was passion, and that's critical, because just because you are a family member or someone who's worked in the organization for a long time, maybe a non-family member, if you're not doing it for the right reasons, if you don't enjoy being there and you're not passionate about the brand and the product and the experience, then it's very difficult to have a vision for what that's going to look like for the future. And in our case, it's a mix. We have a mix of family members who enjoy it and they have a passion and they like being in the operation. But there's a lot of other non-family members who've spent their entire career there, and they plan to stay there until they retire because they really enjoy it. They really enjoy the culture, and that's huge.
And it's so, I'm very fortunate, and I know other people in my position who are fortunate, and I know others who are not. My father gave me so much runway to figure out what kind of leader I wanted to be and what passion in the business meant for me. I run a very different model than my father did. I'm a very different type of leader than my father was. I get excited and passionate about things that are very different from what he got excited and passionate about. And I think sometimes in family business, there's an expectation of, well, your mother and I or your uncle and I or whoever did it this way. Why don't you do it this way? And believe me, my dad and I had those conversations over the years, but I'm so fortunate that he gave me a lot of space to just sort of figure out who I wanted to be within the business. And if he hadn't done that, I don't know that I would have the passion that you need to be able to do this job.
All right. What do you, as we wrap up our time here on this podcast, what do you wish someone would have told you earlier in the process?
For me, there is a Haudenosaunee guiding principle that I hope respectfully I'm going to get mostly right. When we make decisions, we should be thinking for 7 generations. How is this going to impact 7 generations? Now, I would tell you it's very challenging to draft a succession plan and be thinking 7 generations of business down the road. I don't know many family businesses that are that old. But I think sometimes we think about what's going to work right now or what's going to work next without taking the longer view. And I can see things my grandparents set up in their succession plan with great intention, without really understanding the ramification of how it was going to make it a little bit harder for me to lead and plan my own succession, because I have some restrictions around me that are a little bit of a challenge. And so I wish if I could rewind time back to when I first came into the business full time, that I'd had a better awareness of what some best practices for succession planning are, because we could have had those conversations as 3 generations of a family together, and plans together to set us up to make some handoffs a little bit smoother. I wish I had been a little better educated on succession planning. And I think the other thing is, it would not have changed anything for me. I do wish I had understood the weight of the responsibility. I think that, I don't want to say it caught me off guard because it didn't really happen all at once, but, I took my father's job duties over little by little, and I would have told you before he retired I was probably doing 95% of his job, but the real work is in that last 5%. There is a difference between advising the person sitting in the chair and being in the chair yourself, and I think I probably could have prepared myself for that a little bit better.
Gotcha. Shawn, how about you?
I would echo that as well. I was working alongside the CEO in the business for almost 4 years with, having the last year really, he had stepped aside and I was working pretty much full time in that role. But it does make a difference when you're the only person who makes that final decision. And there's really no way to plan for it, I suppose. You just try to make sure that you're drawing on all the experience that you have, and you ask lots of people for their opinion before you make that final decision. But it is a lofty responsibility, and it's something that you really can't understand, I guess, until you're put in that position. But the other thing I was going to add, just a couple thoughts that I don't know that I would say I wish I knew earlier in the process. I'm just glad we did what we did during the process. So 2 of those things. One is communication. We were very intentional about over communicating with everybody in the organization at every level about what we were doing and what the process was that we were, executing for not only the succession plan, but sort of the future of the company. I think oftentimes there's these closed door meetings where, the executives or the ownership is working on something and there can be some gossip and some confusion around that. We were very transparent with everyone what we were working on, and as we developed, new roles that needed to be filled, or we were thinking about new things we would do operationally, we were making sure that we were intentional about communicating that. That's one part. The second part is absolutely taking time to celebrate the contributions of anyone in the company that has decided that it's, either on their own or been encouraged that it's their time to retire from the company. We were very intentional about celebrating them and celebrating their success and their contributions. And that's, again, kind of at every level, just because it's not someone who is in a senior leadership role, if they've given a lot of time to the company and, they've been there for, in some cases decades, we're very intentional about celebrating them and making sure that we honor what their contributions have been. So those 2 things made the process a little smoother. And then when it was time for those people to leave, I felt like they were honored in the right way. and their memories preserved.
It's really interesting, the fact that you want to celebrate the legacy and the history while you're still looking forward and trying to create the future. That's, boy, it kind of sums up all of our goals with our businesses, right? Well, I think that's about all the time for questions we have now. But I'd like to thank you both for sharing your stories and the lessons that you learned. It's become very clear to me that succession planning, it's not sitting down with a piece of paper and coming up with a written plan. It's really about having conversations. It's about honoring the legacy, and it's about thinking about, I like that, 7 generations forward. What does success look like? What's the goal? And we tell our business owners, start with the end in mind for a reason, because had you known earlier sometimes what that goal looks like, maybe it would have set some different plans or some people into different positions to make that hopefully easier to execute. To our listeners, if you're thinking about the future now, or if we've made you think about some things that you maybe haven't yet, please don't wait to start thinking about your succession plans. CEL is always here to support you, as well as Western New York has a wealth of family businesses and other businesses who have gone through this that typically, in my experience, are really generous with sharing their time and their lessons for new business owners. So thank you very much for listening, and stay tuned for our next podcast.